I see in the quotes documents the phrase Ohio General Assembly. It makes me think of like the UN General Assembly, but it got invaded by Ohio.
It's like the everything is Ohio meme.
It's all Ohio. Always has been.
We're now to part 4 of our series on the most famous revolutionary you have never heard of, Laszlo Kossuth. Where we left off last time, the Habsburg monarchy had finally smashed the Hungarian Revolution, but not without Kossuth and his associates escaping. Kossuth and his wife and entourage now sailed from Southampton to the United States on the Cunard liner Humboldt. Despite never setting foot in the U.S. and having a shaky relationship with the American sailors who rescued him, Kossuth was already a celebrity in America. Kossuth's journey in December of 1851 was not easy for the former governor of Hungary, whom we could informally call a landlubber. On top of his normal health issues, he was thoroughly seasick during the 11-day journey. But finally, on December 5th, the Humboldt slid into Pier 4 of Staten Island. I hope that the listener and my fellow hosts can now forgive me for repeating the series' introduction. I wish to bear in mind these extraordinary events that unfolded when Kossuth entered New York City now, not as a hook, but with hours of explanatory context behind them. After waiting a day for the city to make preparations, Kossuth entered Manhattan to a scene the New York Times described as one the world seldom beholds. Guards had to repel a mob of onlookers to allow Kossuth and his wife to board the ship crossing the bay. For an hour he toured the harbor. Cannon salutes from merchant ships and shore batteries followed the entire time. A massive throng of people greeted him on the other side. To jubilant cheering, Kossuth bowed to the people of New York. His entourage wore mock felt hats and feathers stuck into them to mimic Hungarian national dress. The caps were accidentally taken as gifts from New York City hatter John Ganin, who tried selling them on board. They were ushered into Castle Garden, a fort in southern Manhattan with a varied history, including being the point of customs before Ellis Island. The Hungarians were greeted by Mayor Ambrose Kingland. The fort, which only stands on 1 acre of land, was packed with 10,000 people. The foundations vibrated under the weight of the crowd and a band playing Hail to the Chief, if anyone could hear the music. The crowd was impossible to contain, drowning out the mayor's address. Kossuth shouted, "Oh, it's impossible, Mr. Mayor," and offered to give his notes to the press. Egged on by the crowd, he tried once more. This time, the crowd pushed forward to seize Kossuth and his wife, and they made their escape through a rear door, but not before a woman clipped a piece of Kossuth's coat as a memento.
Wow, he's like a rock star.
So Kossuth did manage to get some of his speech off, which I have part of for us.
Your generous part in my liberation is taken by the whole world for the revelation of the fact that the United States are resolved not to allow the despots of the world to trample on oppressed humanity. That is why my liberation was cheered from Sweden to Portugal as a ray of hope. And here I stand to plead the cause of common human rights before your great republic.
Following his introduction, Kossuth introduced his priorities.
First, that I take it to be duty of honor and principle not to meddle with any party question of your own domestic affairs. Secondly, I profess my admiration for the glorious principle of union, on which stands the mighty pyramid of your greatness. Within the limits of your laws, I will use every honest exertion to gain your effectual sympathy. Thirdly, I frankly state that my aim is to restore my fatherland to the full enjoyment of her own independence.
And ended with more pandering.
Let me add with a sigh of thanksgiving to the Almighty God that Providence has selected your glorious country to be the pillar of freedom, as it is already the asylum to oppressed humanity. The world would then soon be free, and you the saviors of humanity. Citizens of New York, it is under your protection that I place the sacred cause of freedom and the independence of Hungary.
It is an interesting note. This isn't scripted, just in retrospect, that in the way he's selling his opening speech to the US is he's still very much doing like playing the lawyer in terms of like claiming to respect the laws and all that stuff and being quote unquote apolitical, just legal. The mob outside the fort was even larger, with around 250,000 people lining Broadway south of Central Park. Brooklyn was practically deserted. New Jerseyites waited for hours to board ferries to Manhattan. The crowd was so excited that Kossuth's carriage at one point was paused for 2 hours, and at least one man was killed by the crowding. Broadway was decorated with thousands of Hungarian tricolors, portraits of Kossuth, George Washington, and the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Mejid I, as well as the Marquis de Lafayette. Signs read slogans like,
U.S. to Russia, mind your own business.
His visit reminds us of our neglected duty to freedom.
Gratitude! As the people of the United States were assisted by valor and treasure from abroad, our government should be the first to interfere abroad in favor of the holy principles of progress.
That last one really rolls off the tongue as a political slogan, doesn't it?
I think it's great. I mean, it reminds me of all of those titles from way back when that had names such as A Treatise on the Recognized Value of International Mercantilism in the Time Anno Domini. Just kind of keeps going ad infinitum, right?
Like a page-long title.
It makes me feel way less bad about how wordy my protest sign is.
Although, honestly, I know some, like, emo songs that definitely have way longer titles.
Kossuth spent his evening exhausted in a city-provided apartment, adorned with posters of him in Washington, hounded by torchlight parades outside. He knew that in the American people he had a key to support Hungary's revolution. Kossuth's first significant private act in the U.S. was to order a copy of George Washington's writings, which he would devour over the next week. On the 11th, during a dinner hosted for Kossuth by New York City, he seized the opportunity to put his readings to use. He rose to give a 3-hour-long speech on American foreign policy to his fellow guests. Kossuth denounced America's religious attachment to George Washington and his obsolete isolationism. Washington's advice only made sense for a young America.
Is the dress which well suited the child still convenient for the full-grown man? Nay, the giant which you are.
Kossuth contended that if the U.S. did not use its power, the U.S. would degrade to
the rotting vegetarian. The end of the sentence hit me too hard. The rotting vegetation of a Paraguay.
Kossuth too denounced the Monroe Doctrine as being obsolete, destroyed by America's own invention of the steamboat, with which
distance is blotted from the dictionary.
Instead,
aren't we trying to bring back the Monroe Doctrine right now?
It's the Donroe Doctrine, I believe.
Oh my god.
Instead,
I gotta go drink after that.
Instead, it was time for America to extend the Monroe Doctrine to the gates of St. Petersburg and spread liberal democracy to the heart of global tyranny.
Based. We need to do that now. More drones to Ukraine.
Kossuth's speech at New York City would be seen as the start of an ideology he coined as intervention for non-interventionism, with a 4-point plan provided at the end of his speech. First, President Fillmore should tell the Russian Tsar that any aggression against Hungary would not be viewed indifferently by the United States. Second, the U.S. should patrol the Mediterranean to protect its trade from Russia. Third, the U.S. should recognize Hungary's independence. And fourth, he asked for money to continue his struggle, loans or otherwise. And, I just want to say it's amazing. Just remember, this is like, he's a dinner guest. They're celebrating. And this guy literally stands up to give a lecture to his guests on foreign policy that nobody asked for.
Well, they asked for it by going to his dinner party.
Yeah, I was going to say, it feels right. It feels very
It's
very
like
accurate.
expecting to go to my apartment to visit me and not getting lore dumped with girls' frontline stuff.
There you go.
In the audience was American diplomat James Watson Webb, which is a hell of a name for someone who didn't go into science, who was bitter over having previously been denied appointment as charge d'affaires to Austria and blamed it on Kossuth's popularity. He rose with a prepared speech to attack Kossuth, but was coughed down by the audience. And remember how Kossuth had learned English from Shakespeare while in jail? This played into Kossuth's hand. He was said to entrap his audiences with his uniquely beautiful voice. His grammar was oddly poetic, and his speech full of archaic literary words filtered through his Hungarian accent. More intentional were his references to history. As we saw with invoking Washington, Wherever he traveled, he tried to personalize his speeches to whom he was meeting. General Klapka, who had joined Kossuth in America, and the fellow Hungarian exiles Count Polski and his wife were tasked with finding useful passages of biographies and local histories for Kossuth to incorporate into speeches. This also impacted his wider messaging. In D.C., he emphasized international law. In the West, at the time a hotbed of nationalism, he warned against foreign invasion. In the South, he highlighted the states' rights of Hungary, and in New England, he pushed universal liberty.
See, there's the pandering.
One speech that I think highlights Kossuth's personalization is one given to the woman of New York City. In it, he leans into Hungary's liminal position between the West and East, claiming that his and Hungary's exotic Oriental heritage gave them the highest chivalric regards for the ladies, and that
there is not perhaps on the face of the earth a nation which in its institutions has shown more chivalric regard for ladies than the Hungarian. It is a praiseworthy trait of the Oriental character.
But his female-focused framing didn't end there. Kossuth too emphasized the revolutionary role of women's money.
It is no arbitrary praise. It is a fact that in the struggle for our rights and freedoms, we had no more powerful auxiliaries and no more faithful executioners of the will of the nation than the women of Hungary. You know, in ancient Rome, after the Battle of Cannae, which was won by Hannibal, the Senate called on the people spontaneously to sacrifice all their wealth on the altar of their fatherland. Every jewel, every ornament was brought forth, but still the tribune judged it necessary to pass a law prohibiting the ladies of Rome to wear more than half an ounce of gold or parti-colored splendid dresses. Now we want in Hungary no such law. The women of Hungary brought all they had. You would have been astonished to see how, in the most wealthy of houses of Hungary, if you were invited to dinner, you would be forced to eat soup with iron spoons.
I do just love the character note here of being like, yeah, I'm giving a speech to some random American woman. Let me bring up Roman history. Kossuth managed to play to the sentiments of the famous cult of domesticity, America's Victorian gender ideology that placed women in the home, but also as the moral guides of their family.
Nobody can do more for it than you. The heart of a man is soft wax in your tender hands. Mold it, ladies. Mold it with... mold it.
Yeah, mold it, exactly. Girls. You mold it. Yeah.
Mold it, ladies. Mold it into the form of generous compassion for my country's wrongs. Inspire it with the noble feelings of your own hearts. Inspire it with the consciousness of your country's power, dignity, and might. You are the framers of man's character. One thing about living in an apartment complex is when I'm reading this, I sometimes wonder if people outside are walking by and what they think of like me reading these out of context.
I mean, I think they know. I mean, come on, we're talking about Kossuth. Come on.
Who doesn't know about Kossuth?
How can they not know?
Everyone is subscribed to the As It Were podcast. Hit that like and subscribe button, fellas and ladies.
Of course.
And non-binary pals.
Another speech, titled On Nationality, to a gathering of the New York City press, also highlights his personalization.
80 years ago, the immortal Franklin's own press was almost the only one in the colonies. Now you have above 3,000 newspapers with a circulation of 5 million of copies. But what is more, I boldly declare that, except in the United States, there is scarcely anywhere a practical freedom of the press.
Relating their job to his own experience.
Yes, gentlemen, I commend my public career as a journalist. You, under your happy institutions, know not the torment of writing with hands fettered by an Austrian censor.
Kossuth also promoted America's high school education system with surprising detail.
Do you know, gentlemen, what I consider to be your most glorious monument? If it be, as I have read, that when your engineers draw geometrical lines to guide your wandering squatters in the solitudes where virgin nature adores her lord, they place on every 36 square of the district marked out to be a township a modest wooden pole with the glorious mark, Popular Education. This is your proudest monument. In my opinion, not your geographical situation, not your material power, not the bold, enterprising spirit of your people is the chief guarantee of their future, but the universality of education for a whole people, once they become intelligent, never can consent not to be free. Based, actually, once I read and understand what I said.
I was going to say, I think you would probably die if you saw what the modern U.S. was doing. And
I don't know. We're pretty much giving up our freedoms pretty regularly.
Okay, but are we going to say the American public education is good?
I mean, back then, definitely. I mean, for
Yeah, but
relative
now...
to the rest of the world.
Yeah, he's turning in his grave in Hungary right now, if that's where he's buried.
I mean, it depends what district he went to.
Argument for another time.
And speeches he did give, including one on international law to the American Bar Association on December 18th. The speech was so popular that the bar donated $15,000 based on its profits to Kossuth, remarking that they had become a revolutionary committee. An audience member planted by Webb tried to debate Kossuth during the dinner at the bar, but his attempt was also shouted down.
Wow, they had a debate streamer drama even back in the 1800s.
Yeah, he would have loved Twitch. Smaller donations also came pouring in to support Kossuth, and as a reminder, New York City was funding his entire entourage while they stayed. Non-monetary donations included 500 acres of land from a telegraph company, books, rings, paintings, and from Jackson's former secretary, a basket containing bullets from Bunker Hill, the Battle of New Orleans, and locks of hair from Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson. By the summer of 1852, a bipartisan Central Hungarian Committee was formed and issued bonds to be repaid when Kossuth became ruler of Hungary. But isn't that basket like a hell of a gift basket? Just like former president's locks of hairs. Here you go.
I was going to say, it's got a lot of hair in it.
Yeah, I know.
It's kind of interesting.
Were they still alive when this happened?
believe-
Or is this dead person hair?
I would say Jefferson was definitely dead. I'm not sure.
Washington was definitely dead.
Andrew Jackson might have still been a thing, but I think
Jefferson
he was
died.
dead.
Yeah, Jefferson died in 1826.
1 second. When did Andrew Jackson die? Andrew
Maybe he was probably dead.
Jackson. Death. 1845 is when he died. So he was actually only like 6 years off. Or wait, more than that. Oh, so I want to know how the hell he got a lock of Andrew Jackson's hair and also Thomas Jefferson's hair.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, like, I know giving locks of hair was definitely more of a thing in the past. I'm not saying it's a thing now. It might be. But it was a very common kind of like memento. But
Oh, okay.
it still kind of begs the question as to, like, what did somebody do to deserve said memento?
Other people managed to profit off of Kossuth as well. The hatter I briefly mentioned from earlier, Ganin, by his act, had managed to create a Kossuth hat craze that quickly sold out his supply, with an estimated $500,000 being spent on his hats in total.
1 second, I need to look up how much that is in today's dollars. What year is this again?
1851.
The CPI inflation calculator only goes back to the 1900s, unfortunately.
Well, maybe it was like $1,900 then, for as close as we can get.
The closest we can get is 1913. $500,000 in 1913 would be $16.5 million in today. So we know as a lower bound, that person made at least the equivalent of $16.5 million.
Smaller merchants tried to peddle Kossuth miniatures, Kossuth buttons, Hungarian flags, and Kossuth-inspired dances erupted across New York City.
They had TikTok dances back then.
Basically. Someone even opened a Kossuth restaurant. The American Bible Society elected Kossuth as vice president to capitalize on his image. One photography company remarked that they, unlike Austria, had managed to capture his image. A rat poison manufacturer named Leon even made an advert poem based on Kossuth.
Kossuth's coming, so they say. He's a lion in his way, and made tyranny his prey. But for bugs and such as they, our old lion is okay. Rats and mice, too, he can slay.
Which is just such a forced way to try to just shoehorn Kossuth into your product.
Were there any shoehorn manufacturers that did anything? That's a good question.
I didn't
now.
see anything, but...
that would have made that so much better.
Hearing of the excitement, President Fillmore sent his son to personally invite Kossuth to Washington, D.C. Following this, Kossuth announced that he would do an American tour, visiting Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. He also added probably Cincinnati, which he disliked merely by its nickname of Queen City, unfittingly unrepublican.
I too don't like Cincinnati.
Listeners with any familiarity of American history might have been curious at the large absence of the obvious elephant in the room, which would only a decade later tear America apart: slavery. And to quickly emphasize how important slavery was during this time period for those unfamiliar, despite the northern half of the country having outlawed it and the importation of slaves having already been banned, enslaved African Americans as property were the second most valuable collective commodity in the U.S. during this era, only surpassed by the land of the U.S. itself. The U.S. economy was dominated by exports of cotton grown by enslaved African Americans, which fueled Europe's textile mills in a fashion similar to how modern Gulf states have economies dominated by oil exports to global industry. As I mentioned, the Hungarian issues had taken Congress's time away from the passing of the infamous Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, which obligated Northerners to arrest self-emancipated African Americans who fled from the South. So he's coming into the U.S. at a time when slavery was basically the political issue. Kossuth intentionally and publicly ignored the slavery question, knowing that it was a landmine he did not want to step on if he was interested in maximizing donations. This became the first chink in his popularity in the U.S. At first, Kossuth was popular among American abolitionists, though historian Donald Spencer notes that they were bewildered at his nationwide popularity as they saw him as preaching a similar message of universal freedom, which they had been scorned for doing for so long. Now, their champion was being neutral on slavery and more popular than themselves, using their own messaging. Famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass himself remarked that Kossuth was no longer being Kossuth to satisfy the American public. Despite this, abolitionists sought to capitalize on Kossuth mania too, and championed an image where Hungary were enslaved African Americans and the Habsburgs were the enslavers, comparing Emperor Franz Joseph speaking of his subjects to how a southern gentleman speaks of his slaves. Pro-slavery ideology was denounced by abolitionists as Austrianism. Abolitionists also tried to win Kossuth over to the cause, regularly sending him propaganda material and information about American slavery. In short, abolitionists, in Spencer's words, liked him as a tool for domestic reform. Abolitionists proved an impossible issue for Kossuth to avoid. One morning, as he was entering his New York City's hotel's ballroom, the Hungarian noble found a large group of African American men waiting for his arrival. Kossuth felt uneasy, but still approached them. Abolitionist George Downing stepped forward from the group. He had previously sold Kossuth oysters to promote his business. Downing read off a prepared statement, wishing him success on his mission to promote the principle that a man has a right to the full exercise of his faculties in the land which gave him birth, and concluded that the Hungarian Revolution was the common struggle of all humankind. Kossuth's response was laconic. He told them that
The time for address has passed. The time for action has come.
asked them for donations, then quickly ushered the group out the door.
Giga Chad, give me money or leave.
Yes, this is very much testing how far his universal liberalism go. Oh, it's once like the actually oppressed people in America want something from him. So, Kossuth, who was already annoyed by abolitionists, was fuming at this, thinking that those African Americans wanted to embarrass him. He issued a public statement reaffirming that he did not want to be mixed up with domestic sectionalism about slavery. However, to abolitionists, being neutral was to support the status quo of slavery. William Garrison, a prominent abolitionist and advocate for women's suffrage, dragged Kossuth in his widely read paper, The Liberator. Kossuth was
criminal, cowardly, selfish, as demented as Don Quixote, deaf, dumb, and blind.
Garrison later published an over 100-page-long letter deriding the Hungarian noble as a hypocrite. I have some of it for us here.
There is one stain on our national escutcheon that your vision has failed to detect, and that is the blood of the almost exterminated Indian tribes and of millions of the descendants of Africa. Spurn the bribe. Ford not the South Run River. Death courses its crimson tide forever. A flood of sin too strong for man's recalling, where slavery reigns and breeds its crimes appalling.
From dismal swamps of Carolina's planting, from Georgia's hills, the volleyed hymn is chanting. Give back our freedom, slaves all past describing, Hungarian martyrs spurn their loathsome bribing.
Well, this republic thou art warmly thanking, for aiding thee once more to breathe free air. 3,000,000 slaves their galling chains are clanking. Heartbroken, bleeding, crushed beyond compare, at public sale with swine and cattle ranking the wretched victims of complete despair. Dude, that's a sonnet. Why did you break that into 3 parts?
These are quotes from multiple different poems.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so he wrote multiple sonnets about this.
Yes, it's 100 pages long.
Oh my god.
Yes.
Multiple sonnets.
Like, by itself, that's a sonnet. But, like, yeah, wow, that's a thing.
Yeah.
Holy crap. Okay, cool.
One more quote from it.
Oh, shall the millions here in bondage sighing, branded as beasts and scourged with bloody whips, the property of tyrants God defying, hear not one word of pity from thy lips? Oh, be not dumb to thy reproach undying, and thy great fame save from a dire eclipse.
But, like, we should bring back just dissing people with sonnets.
I'm down with that. I think, like, the best thing you can do is go to someone and be like, hey, dude, I care about you so much that I wrote a poem. I wrote a poem for you in your tribute, and then read it, and it's just like, I mean, it's no different than a rap battle, right? Like, it really is just a rap battle, except in iambic pentameter.
Despite his detractors among radical abolitionists, Kossuth remained widely popular as he left New York City on his way to Washington. When Kossuth reached D.C. in early January, he received another large reception as he saw everywhere. A group of Native Americans appeared to give their sympathy to his program, as well as Washington's Jewish community. Jewish leaders gave Kossuth a donation and a painting of Moses, with his hands resting on the shoulders of Kossuth and George Washington. Elected officials appeared in droves to pay their respect. However, despite being personally invited, Kossuth was going to have a difficult time winning over President Fillmore to do concrete action, as he was a moderate Whig opposed to the more radical liberals. Considering himself not responsible for slavery, Fillmore critically supported enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act to preserve the integrity of the world's largest republic. Similarly, Spencer argues that Fillmore was immoderate in foreign policy, having condemned the failed 1851 Lopez expedition launched from New Orleans to annex Cuba as a slave state, and proclaimed back in 1850 that the U.S. had no right to interfere in other nations. I'm not sure if this last part of the assessment is entirely fair, as Fillmore was also the president that sent Matthew Perry to open Japan up by literal gunboat diplomacy, which again, one of the ships that was part of that was the USS Mississippi, which rescued Kossuth, and he had a vested interest in promoting American control over the Kingdom of Hawaii. Nevertheless, Secretary of State Daniel Webster was instructed to give a deaf ear to any request for intervention when meeting Kossuth. But while meeting Webster, Kossuth managed to win an audience with the president as he promised to not give him a speech. Kossuth met with President Fillmore and a delegation of senators on New Year's Eve, 1851. He gave a speech. Kossuth argued that the U.S. had already committed itself to supporting Hungarian independence by rescuing him, and misattributed a quote to Fillmore to portray him as an avid interventionist. Fillmore told Kossuth that he was incorrect and could not expect American aid outside as being treated as a welcome guest. However, he still politely offered Kossuth a dinner on January 6th, which Kossuth accepted. On January 7th, the House of Representatives welcomed Kossuth in open session to the dissent of 30 Southern Democrats. This honor had only previously been given to the Marquis de Lafayette. Hours later, Congress threw a celebratory dinner for Kossuth at the National Hotel with 250 guests. Among the jubilant partygoers was Kossuth's greatest potential ally in the Fillmore administration, Secretary of State Webster. As we saw, Webster was a strong interventionist and pro-Hungarian. However, Webster also had to balance his loyalty to the administration. Webster's dinner speech merely cheerfully declared that progress was inevitable and that one day Austria would recognize that the cost of oppressing Hungary was not worth it. He ended with a toast to Hungarian independence. The press jumped on his final toast and spun it as an endorsement for Hungarian independence by the administration. Austria's chargé d'affaires was also enraged by Webster's toast and sent an ultimatum demanding that he either be removed or Austria would suspend its diplomatic relations with the United States. Fillmore defended Webster, leading to the Austrian diplomat refusing to permanently set foot back in D.C. for over a year.
What are they going to do? Like send their massive navy that has one accessible port to go destroy us? Right.
Yeah.
Austria-Hungary was mostly landlocked.
Yeah, I mean, and also I sincerely doubt, although this is not coming from an actual historical source, that the United States and Austria-Hungary had like a giant trading relationship or anything back then too.
Yeah, that doesn't feel right.
Having been rebuffed by Fillmore and only given pleasant words by Webster, Kossuth now tried to win over the aging statesman known as the Great Compromiser Henry Clay. Clay had officially retired from politics back in December 1851, but the 74-year-old still lingered in political circles. However, when they spoke on January 9th, Clay also refused to endorse intervention, claiming that isolation from Europe had made America prosper. Kossuth tried to counter that a war against Russia would be easy and the US would easily find an ally in the Ottoman Empire, who for reference would go to war with Russia before the end of next year. Clay was not convinced. Being spurred by the mainstream Whig Party, Kossuth seemed to lack any realistic allies in the U.S. government. In fact, Southern Democrats had already turned on Kossuth. Despite his neutrality on the institution, they increasingly saw Kossuth as a product of unstable Northern capitalism which threatened Southern slavery. As proper conservatives, they took offense at comparing Kossuth, who had led a failed movement, to George Washington, who had a real legacy. Worst of all, Kossuth was now speaking to Northern Whigs. How could he be trusted if he spoke to those abolitionists, Seward and Webster? However, as you might expect, Kossuth still found supporters. They primarily came from Westerners and Northerners, part of the burgeoning pro-interventionist movement dubbed Young America. Young Americans took inspiration from a European trend. Young denoted a liberal nationalist clique, most famously the Young Turks, who perpetrated the Armenian genocide, but Kossuth himself had been associated with a local movement dubbed Young Hungary. Another figure who was associated with young movements was Karl Marx, who was a member of a group called the Young Hegelians, and who based much of his communist ideology on critiquing them. One strong supporter of Kossuth was a media mogul and abolitionist named Gamaliel Bailey. Bailey became entrapped by and promoted with his paper a conspiracy theory that Austria was colluding with Southern slavers. Austria's charge d'affaires allegedly was seen advising Southern Democrats to vote against welcoming Kossuth. Ministers of the Continental Powers allegedly even sat behind the Southern senators during a vote. By February 1852, Bailey published that the fundamental principle of intervention was love thy neighbor as thyself, and declared that the apostles of the Bible were interventionists. The Maine legislature passed a resolution calling for the U.S. to exert its influence to prevent Russia from attacking republicanism. Massachusetts legislature invited Kossuth to their state, and the governor of Massachusetts declared that the U.S. should interfere in favor of any republic threatened by European monarchy. Back on January 8th, Abraham Lincoln, declaring that resisting Russia would not have violated non-interventionism, held a Kossuth meeting in a Springfield, Illinois courthouse, which he ironically resolved.
That it is the right of any people sufficiently numerous for national independence to throw off, to revolutionize their existing form of government, and to establish such other in its stead as they may choose.
Democratic Senator Isaac Pigeon Walker of Wisconsin declared that
war is to be less dreaded than ignoble peace, peace at the expense of peace.
I just want to say I love the name Pigeon Walker.
Yes. There's a few name alerts in this.
Who are you? I am the Pigeon Walker. It's like a great superhero that doesn't exist yet. Or does he?
The same day, Kossuth met with a delegation of non-Southern Democrats at a banquet celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans from the War of 1812. Among the prestigious attendees sympathetic to Kossuth included Sam Houston, former president of the Republic of Texas.
Wait, there's actually a Sam Houston. Is he who Houston's named after? Is this like a real life?
I believe it's named after his dad, but not him.
You didn't know this?
I did not know that. No, this feels like actually.
Wait, you didn't know there was an actual... Yeah, he was...
You go ahead.
No, that's like totally true.
Yeah. The hall was decorated with American, Hungarian, and Turkish flags. The Democrats toasted to Kossuth and an end to isolationism. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, widely seen as a potential presidential nominee, though largely aligned himself with Southern Democrats, carefully worded his interventionist speech as a condemnation of the Fillmore administration for disavowing the Lopez expedition, which had been supported by Southerners. However, this did not crystallize into anything substantial in D.C., and by late January, Kossuth had left to do a speaking tour of the West and South. 1852 was the presidential election year, and Kossuth hoped to exploit the political media. Although you would think that an election year would probably be the worst time for him to be campaigning because he's like competing with the literal presidential election, but meh. On January 14th, while Kossuth was speaking at the Pennsylvania House Chamber, hundreds of women forced their way into the room. Women sat on the legislators' desks and in the aisle. The chamber's doors were so full of women that they were impossible to close. A legislature moved to adjourn for the day, but lost the voice vote loudly influenced by the uninvited guests. The Speaker of the House even summoned the Pennsylvania militia, who were laughed at by the crowd when their captain announced that he would arrest those who refused to leave. Finally, they gave up and let Kossuth speak to the entire crowd. Kossuth mania followed in Ohio, at the time a liberal bastion bolstered by abolitionism and European exiles from the revolutions of 1848. Ahead of his arrival, Ohio's legislature had declared that an attack on Hungary was an attack on us all. Thousands attended his rally in Cleveland, where the True Democrat paper declared that Kossuth deserved
money, muskets, men, powder, pistols, and prayer.
Hamilton County, Ohio, donated 500 muskets from their militia's arsenal. Speaking to the Ohio General Assembly, Kossuth spoke in his old archaic accent, declaring that the Star-Spangled Banner waved over a new Sinai, and that,
"Henceforward, ye despots of the world, that ye shall not kill nations, ye shall not steal their freedom, and that ye shall not covet what is your neighbor's."
And by and large, his religious angle buoyed Ohioan support for him. In Indiana and Missouri, Kossuth continued using the same rhetoric and predicted that the U.S. and Russia were destined to go to war. More specifically of Ohio, Kossuth said of the state on February 5th in Columbus that,
"I loved Ohio before I knew what I had yet to hear. Now I love her with the affection and tenderness of a child, knowing that part she took in my restoration to liberty and life. Sir, entering the young state of Ohio, my sorrows relax while I look around me in astonishment and rub my eyes to ascertain that is not the magic of a dream, which makes your bold, mighty, and flourishing commonwealth rich with all the marks of civilization and life. Here, where almost yesterday was nothing but a vast wilderness."
in Cincinnati, he declared,
Before I answer you, let me look over this animated ocean, that I may impress upon my memory the look of those who have transformed the wilderness of a primitive forest into an immense city, of which there exists a prediction that, by the year of our Lord 2000, it will be the greatest city in the world. Yeah, not quite. And yet, when I look at you, citizens of Cincinnati, I see no race of giants, astonishing by uncommon frame. I see men as I am wont to see my whole life. Let me recall a curious fact. It is just 100 years ago that the first trading house upon the Great Miami was built by the daring English adventurers. at a place known as Laramie Store, then the territory of the Twigtwee Indians. Since that time, France has been twice a republic and changed its constitution 13 times, and through 36 million strong, it has lost every foot of land in the continent of America, and at home it lies prostrate beneath the feet of the most inglorious usurper that has ever dared raise ambition's bloody seat upon the ruins of liberty. And your republic? It has grown to a giant superpower. And Ohio? Out of the ruins of a trading house into a mighty commonwealth.
So there's the promised Ohio's biggest fanboy from the beginning. So Otto, you recently went to Ohio, right?
Last year, yeah.
Did you come off with the same impression?
No, not particularly. The coolest thing there was the U.S. Air Force fighter jets I went to go see.
Nice.
Well, actually, Wapakoneta and the Air and Space Museum was also pretty cool.
Cool.
Shout out to Wapakoneta.
However, despite the great momentum he carried, Kossuth's movement gained little staying power once the fundraisers left town. In the word of Phil Oakes, I'll send all the money you ask for, but don't ask me to come on along. One of Kossuth's more lasting legacies was a Senate debate on foreign policy that would go through March. Western Democrats and radical Whigs stood for interventionism against Southern Democrats, moderate Whigs, and Southern Whigs. John Clark, a Whig from Rhode Island, introduced resolutions against Kossuth, declaring that the U.S.'s domestic commitment to human rights could not interfere with the U.S.'s interests overseas. A particular snub was a point committing the U.S. to relations with de facto governments only. William Seward countered, protesting Russia and declaring that the U.S. would not stand indifferent to acts of oppression wherever they occurred.
And that's how we got Alaska from them. I mean, that was Seward's folly, man.
Yeah, I gotta say, his position is a little ironic here.
Yeah.
Louisiana Senator Pierre Solé, an exiled Frenchman who raved with the intensity only befitting a convert, declared on March 17th that
the lusty appetite of the U.S. manhood fares ill with what might satisfy the demands of a younger age.
And that just as Christianity grew from the confines of a single church, so too would the U.S.'s gospel of liberty. New Jersey Senator Robbery Field Stockton declared that the war between liberty and despotism was inevitable, and the sooner the U.S. intervened for liberty, the better. Alabama Senator Jeremiah Clemens on February 12th gave another voice to the anti-interventionists. He argued that under the social contract, the U.S.'s primary interest was to support the wishes of its constituents, and that advancing a third party's interests instead would be the highest form of tyranny. Russia had done nothing to harm the U.S., and therefore the Russia issue was one of a third party, not America's. Another important voice against intervention was Jacob Miller, an anti-slavery Whig from New Jersey who broke from his own ideological peers. He contended that intervention made little sense because the U.S. had too much to do at home. The U.S. needed better schools, churches, roads, and harbors. Interventionists had sympathy for Europeans, but not their own Americans. Michigan's Cass provided an image that, while prophetic, failed to sway his opposition at the time. He demanded that the U.S. forget any notion of balance of power between nations, and that the U.S. assert its own law binding as international law. Other nations should obey the U.S. The Senate's mood had changed so greatly that a motion on February 8th to publish Kossuth's thank you letter for the honor of being greeted with an open session of the Senate only passed by one vote. Despite repeatedly coming up for debate, none of the other resolutions in response to Kossuth went to vote. On February 21st, anti-interventionist politicians held a banquet in support of Washington's farewell address, an address which cautioned against foreign entanglement. Kentucky's John Chittenden derided Kossuth as a foreigner who dared to teach Americans when Americans had already learned good governance from George Washington. Washington's farewell address became a rallying cry against intervention, and Kossuth had dared to attack Washington. To make matters worse, at this time, an attack against Kossuth by the revolutionary government's foreign minister, Casimir Batani, was printed in the U.S. for the first time. Batani condemned Kossuth's character as hankering for notoriety, and having a laxity of principle, leading him to make arbitrary decisions which accelerated Hungary's fall. Which, I mean, I wouldn't say is an entirely unfair critique from what we saw earlier. Undeterred, Kossuth decided to meet his fiercest critics head-on in the South on March 7th. Kossuth entered Louisville, Kentucky, where the anti-Kossuth feeling was near universal. His only speech had to be impromptu with little attendance. Audiences from Jackson, New Orleans, Mobile to Charleston were all described as sullenly contemptuous to Kossuth's mission by Spencer. None of his strategy stuck. In New Orleans, he tried to argue that he had nothing to do with slavery, and ironically, as a foreigner, that he had nothing to do with the U.S.'s domestic policy. In Mobile, he even tried to argue that Hungarian rights were Southern rights, as both Hungarians and Southerners championed self-governance. At Jackson, an angry listener claimed that they had a warrant for Kossuth's arrest, believing that Kossuth violated the Neutrality Act of 1818. In South Carolina, there was so little appetite for Kossuth that he had to leave after 2 days. Kossuth returned to Washington, D.C. in mid-April. As the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long, Kossuth was largely ignored. Seward commented that,
Hungary and Kossuth have passed from the memory of all men here but myself.
As Kossuth made his way north, he found that other cities had also lost their fervor for him. The last bastion of support came from New Englanders. A train sent specifically for Kossuth carried him into New England on the 24th of April, 1852. New Haven, Connecticut, once again greeted Kossuth with a cannon salute, and he drew a crowd of 5,000 in Springfield, Massachusetts. Bostonians greeted Kossuth with 34 militia companies to lead him through the city. The city was covered in Hungarian and American flags. Boston Commons was packed with 50,000 listeners. Following his trail in New England were new donations and connections. At New Haven, Connecticut, Eli Whitney, Jr., the son of the inventor of the cotton gin, personally gave Kossuth 20 rifles. At Concord, the famous writer Ralph Waldo Emerson met him. At one meeting, he met with Samuel Gridley Howe, founder of the oldest school for the blind in the U.S., Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, famous author of the Song of Hiawatha, and Charles Sumner, Massachusetts senator. The support was so strong that he decided to stay in New England for an entire month. However, New England alone could not liberate Europe. Kossuth thought that his next path forward would be to influence the Democratic National Convention meeting in Baltimore on June 1st. On May 21st, Kossuth departed south to New York City. Kossuth even sent a letter to a high-ranking party member named Edmund Burke, unrelated to the other one, bribing him to be his agent, informing him about the Congress, and warned Burke that the Democrats should support intervention, as German Americans were prepared to vote regardless of party lines for it. Nothing came of Kossuth's maneuvering. Intervention was hardly a topic during debates, and the Congress nominated Franklin Pierce for the presidency, a character who won nomination due to being relatively unknown and therefore relatively inoffensive to all sides. The Democratic platform adopted by the convention too made little commitment to intervention in Europe, but rather promised to protect rights at home. On June 19th, the Whigs' platform explicitly condemned foreign alliances and interventions. America, concerned with its domestic politics, increasingly moved on from Kossuth. Burke, from earlier, even advised Pierce to deceive Kossuth for his endorsement. Kossuth gave his last speech in America, again asking for funds, this time framed as to bring his mother to America on June 21st. One of Kossuth's final speeches, given on May 20th in Albany, New York, is symbolic of his steam dying down, where he lamented,
More than 5 months have passed since my landing in New York. The novelty has long since subsided, and emotion has died away. The spell is broken, which distance and misfortune cast around my name. The freshness of my ideas is worn out. Incessant toil spread a languor upon me, unpleasant to look upon. The skill of intrigues, aspersing me with calumny, wilful misrepresentations, pouring cold water upon my generous sympathy. In addition to all this, the presidential election, absorbing public attention and lowering every high aspiration into the narrow scope of party spirit, busy for my party triumph. All these circumstances, and many besides too numerous to record, joined to make it probable that the last days of my wanderings on American soil would be different from those in which the hundreds of thousands of the Empire City thundered up to the high heaven the cheers of the hurrahs, till they sounded like the defiance of a free people to a proud despots of the world.
It was also apparent that Kossuth, once Minister of Finance of Hungary, had been horrible with his finances. By June 10th, Kossuth's official figures, which are likely dubious due to how poorly he tracked his donations, were tallied as having raised around $84,000 in total, with only around 1,000 remaining. To give some grounding, from one report on prices I found, $1,000 was equal to the price of 250 dozen eggs in Kossuth, New York in 1852, with $84,000 being about 21,000 dozen eggs. In 1850, $1,000 was about 10 times the average monthly wage of a woman working in a cotton textile mill. Much of this money probably had gone to a pair of ammunition factories Kossuth set up and had to abandon since he did not remember to also save money for their transportation. He put the ammunition under the care of, and quoted from Spencer, a scoundrel he was specifically advised to ignore, who went on to sell them and pocket the money. In his financial desperation, Kossuth became involved in a filibustering scheme led by one Colonel John C. Pickett to invade Haiti and overthrow its black-ruled government. Kossuth was to supply ammunition and public goodwill. In exchange, Pickett would give Kossuth, after the conquest of Haiti, $1 million and the hypothetically seasoned men to liberate Hungary. Kossuth condemned Haitian Emperor Faustin Elie as a Russian agent. However, this scheme also amounted to nothing. Finally, on July 14, 1852, seeing his prospects in America dwindling, and probably not wanting to return his debts, Kossuth and his wife slipped out of the country on a New York Cunard liner as Mr. and Mrs. Smith. They sailed back to England, an unauspicious end to 7 months of touring, where he gave more than 400 prepared speeches. In Britain, Kossuth lingered with other defeated revolutionaries of 1848, including the famous figure of Italian unification, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Most of what money he had left would go to the various causes, and he continued to raise money through smaller speeches. Kossuth would retain one primary contact from the U.S., an interventionist named George Nicholas Sanders, a diplomat appointed to London by President Pierce. As an aside, Sanders would be a curious link, as he publicly advocated for the assassination of heads of state, including Francis Napoleon III. In fact, Sanders would go on to become one of the Confederates accused of plotting the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, fleeing the country to avoid arrest. He even went on to join the European revolutionaries in defending Paris during the days of the famous Paris Commune. Which I have to say, that's one hell of a political journey.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
It's like the
It's kind of like a huge reversal, too.
I was just saying, it's like the meme about like the 14-year-old constantly changing his politics online.
Yeah.
It's from like American liberal to like stereotypical 1800s anarchist to Confederate to Paris communard.
Yeah, back to like anarchist, right? Like that's what's cool about that to me.
When the Crimean War between the Ottomans with France and the UK against Russia broke out in 1854, Kossuth spent his time writing letters to the New York Times, bitterly taunting Franklin Pierce and the American people for not invading Russia and turning the war into one of liberation.
As if that was the only thing to make fun of Pierce for.
Instead, America would go on to do the opposite, and over the years grow close diplomatic ties to Russia as a counter to the British Empire, famously capstoned by then Secretary of State Seward's purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. Reflecting on Kossuth's time in the U.S., Spencer notes that Kossuth did not invent the US's interventionist Young America movement, but had managed to deftly exploit it. Yet, instead of boosting this movement, Kossuth's exploitation actually led to Young America's speedy climax as he thrust European intervention into serious consideration within the sphere of public debate, as well as sent thousands of dollars from the movement's supporters, as well as their energy into the ether. Historian Tim Roberts notes another part of Kossuth's legacy. As I mentioned, Americans lacked strong opinions on Hungary before his arrival, or I should say before the Hungarian Revolution.
I was going to say, I think most of us still lack strong opinions on Hungary. It's not like a country we talk about in America very frequently.
Yeah.
Outside of Orban now, but like...
Kossuth completely upended this, thrusting Hungary into the West for many antebellum Americans, even shifting the Ottoman Empire toward the West as it had sheltered Kossuth. This was since Americans' understanding of the West was in part based on republicanism. Even the UK was often derided as being an Oriental despotism due to its monarchy and class system. Even when this was not the case, Kossuth had challenged Americans' conceptions of the Orient and complicated it into a geography where in some places republicanism was possible. In reverse, Kossuth also turned Austria's image in America to a largely negative one outside the West of an evil despotism that would persist until after the World Wars. Taking Turkey as an example, here's how Kossuth described the country in his 1852 Washington Banquet address to the president.
When we make a comparison between the Turkish government and that of Austria and Russia in respect to religious liberty, the scale turns entirely in favor of Turkey. There is not only toleration for all religions, but the government does not mix with their religious affairs, but leaves these entirely to their own accord. In Turkey, I have not only seen the municipal self-government of cities developed to a very considerable degree, but I have seen administration of justice very much like the institution of a jury.
Which could be easily interpreted by people who didn't know better, as the Ottoman Empire has a government closer to liberal democracy than other European imperial monarchies. In 1859, Kossuth's hopes were again raised, then dashed by the swift 2-month Second Italian War of Independence, which secured Italy's exit from Austria with French support. However, following Italy's formation, he moved to Turin in 1861. Eventually, Austria would grant autonomy to Hungary, reforming the Habsburg Empire into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary in 1867. Kossuth was elected in absentia a delegate to the new Hungarian Diet, but he refused on the grounds that he no longer recognized the Habsburg as the rightful rulers of Austria. In private, he'd later reveal that he was actually against the unification of Austrian-Hungary, not the Habsburgs directly. Kossuth refused to return to Hungary, bitterly chastising his countrymen for not fighting for independence, even refusing to return despite the fact that a law dissolved Hungarian citizenship after 10 years of living abroad. The highlight of Kossuth's exile in Turin would come in 1890 when 2 Hungarians traveled to meet Kossuth with a phonograph intent on recording him. Sadly, the next account is only known from a single source, so take it with a grain of salt. With a friend of Kossuth and his sister, they met on September 19th, which happened to be Kossuth's birthday. For whatever reason, Kossuth was hostile to being recorded, so they framed it as letting him listen to a phonograph. The phonograph bellowed,
"Good morning, Mr. Kossuth,"
in his friend's voice, which surprised Kossuth, and he responded with,
"Hello."
Impressed, Kossuth agreed to a full recording of one of his speeches. 3 cylinders were recorded, the text of the third and only surviving one being,
This question will be answered by the judge of the world history. Let the sacred martyrs in their mortal remains be blessed. Let them in their spirits be blessed with the best knowledge of the fatherland's God of liberty through eternity. October 6th will find me, who is unable to throw myself down in the dust of the Hungarian Golgotha, on my knees in the hermit's abode of my homelessness, stretching my aged arms towards the country that has cast me out, blessing sacred memory of the martyrs with the fervent sentiments of gratitude, their faithfulness to the homeland, and for the sublime example they gave to those who come after, and asking the God of the Magyars with ardent prayers to make victorious the appeal that searches the very marrow of the bone and sounds from the lips of Hungaria to the Hungarian nation. So be it. Amen.
Her speech was regularly played that year in Hungary, including for 4 days during a fair in the modern-day Romanian city of Arad. For the next few years, they'd be sent between Budapest and other cities in the kingdom. The same speech was played over national radio for the first time in 1836 by the fascist-aligned government of Regent Miklo Horthy. Lastly, on March 20th, 1894, Kossuth died at the age of 91 in Turin, Italy. He would be buried in Budapest at a state funeral. To me, I have to say, the history of Kossuth highlights several paradoxes. His story, at first seemingly a tale of great man history, ultimately ends by showing the weakness of placing historical development too strongly onto a single personality. Kossuth championed the end of feudalism despite being a noble himself. Lastly, despite being a proponent of universal liberty, in practice he did little to help the plight of national minorities in both Hungary and the US.